These are aerial views of New Woodstock, central New York State, as it exists now. Only about half of the structures in this aerial view are still there. As you might imagine, much has changed since the mid-1940s when Philip Lord was living in a White House near the train depot just off Main Street. In fact, everything was just off Main Street. The creamery, the service station, the cemetery, the lumber yard, and most importantly, the railroad station. The railroad station saw delivery of coal and wood, and soldiers were going to and coming from war. It was a railroad town, and the sound of the locomotive and rail cars left an indelible imprint on Philip's young mind. These fond memories prompted him to build an exact replica of New Woodstock, as it existed in 1945. Through examination of old photographs and pasting off the size of the structures that still stand, Philip built to scale New Woodstock as it was around the time of the Second World War. Let's listen to the architect himself as we get on a time machine and dial in New Woodstock, New York, 1945.
This is an incredible replica of New Woodstock, circa 1945, built single-handedly by Philip Lord, who lived in this White House on the right side. And I'd like to introduce Philip, who's going to tell us about how we got into this project and a little bit about the life in that time. Phil.
Yeah, thanks. I lived here when I was 2 and 3 years old, and that was in part of 1944 and part of 1945. And we lived right next to the Lehigh Valley Railroad tracks. And my first vivid memory of anything was in that time when the trains would go back and forth past our kitchen window. And because the depot is almost opposite our house, they used to have to stop and back up and drop off cars and pick up cars, and it was always a lot of activity with these locomotives going back and forth on the track through the town. And a lot of the industries that started because of the railroad. So what I had to do was to try to recreate that 3-year-old memory as accurately as I could, and basically a lot of the buildings were still there, so it was a matter of just going out and photographing them and taking some measurements. But about half or more of the buildings associated with the railroad were gone, and so I had to do a historical archaeological project to try to bring them back. Fortunately, the local New Woodstock Historical Society has a huge photograph collection, and from that collection and other documents I was able to reconstruct every single building that was in this section of the town in 1945.
So you built this single-handedly, not from any kits, is that right?
Yeah, well, it couldn't be any kits because the kits would be generic, and every building on this layout is an exact copy of a unique building that was there. So even the depot, there are depot model kits that are fairly close because the Lehigh Valley had a standard design for its depots, but none are exactly right. So what I did was tried to copy using raw materials, styrene sheets that had the right kind of siding on them, and the windows you could get from a company depending on the types of windows and doors the building had. It was possible to match most of them with commercially produced windows and doors, but everything else had to be scratch built.
And Phil, I'm not going to move the camera, but why don't you describe to us Main Street?
Yeah, Main Street, and just out of the view down on this layout was the culture or the commercial center of the town, a small store and a post office and some other buildings. And I have a vague memory of that, but of course not as vivid as the memory of the trains going through. But it's a very small community. It's in the rural part of Madison County, and the trains were the main lifeblood of the place, and that's all gone now. The depot's still there. It's used by the Historical Society as a museum. The tracks have all been torn up. There's nothing there but a grassy strip now. And it was my memory of that time when the trains were running that prompted this whole project.
And this area in the back here with the gray holding tank, what's that?
Well, there was an oil company there, and interestingly, that didn't have anything to do with the railroad. From what local residents have told me, the oil came in on large trucks, and then small trucks would redistribute it to the houses that used oil. And that's not there anymore. The gray barn behind it is still there. The white building over to the left which is the old seed and feed store. That was there since the 1800s, but it burned, I think, in the 1960s or early 70s. But fortunately, I had some very early 20th century and late 19th century photographs of it, so I was able to recreate it exactly as it would have looked.
It looks like there's one of the cars that brought the grain there pulls up right into the back of the structure.
That's an interesting point, because in the photographs there was this little bit of siding that showed at the back where that car is parked. And at first I thought it was a building that was behind the feed store. But as I looked at it more and more, and then as I began to study the shadows as they fell on the foundation, I realized that was a little angled loading dock door that stuck out from the building, and it allowed you to bring a car up and directly work right off the car into the building. So it's a unique feature that at first was overlooked because it just looked like a building in the distance.
And we have the graveyard of New Woodstock over here. It looks like there's some teenagers using it for the seclusion.
Yes, the graveyard is actually a very large graveyard. I only modeled a little bit of it. We said that was the part that this layout covered, but there's also underneath the tree is the Grim Reapers, so you have kind of the best and the worst of the graveyard in one spot.
Huh. And I see over here we have the Lehigh Valley train company coming right through town. That was one of the train companies expanded that time, right?
This was a branch line. It was built on an earlier train line, a company that came through here and was sold to Lehigh Valley. And it's a branch line, which means that it was not part of the main line that ran up from the coal fields in Pennsylvania out to western New York, but it was a line that connected off the main line up to Canastota. And so these were smaller trains. The engine is actually the larger of two engine types that worked on the branch line, but is quite a bit smaller than some of the ones that worked on the main line. And they would primarily come up through here. The term milk train, which is meant to imply a small, relatively insignificant train, applies here because a lot of what was carried out of New Woodstock and down to New York City even was the milk from the local dairy farmers. And over on the far right there's a creamery that processed some of that milk. And there's a coal company that took coal off of the trains and then distributed it locally through trucks. Lumber yard that probably shipped out lumber. And of course the feed and seed store, and a number of other businesses that kind of grew up around the railroad. So it was a local service type of railroad system.
And I see in the back here there's a coal and lumber structure, and next to it a service station. And can you tell us anything about that?
Right. Well, the lumber company, all the red buildings are owned by one person, Thompson. And so Thompson's coal and lumber company was just that. It supplied the local area with its coal and its lumber, and the coal cars would come in on the railroad. Then they would dump their coal into a chute, which would then be elevated up to the top of the building and then redistributed to bins based on the size of the coal, and then trucks would come up on the far side, load up what they needed, whether it was coal for the stove or furnace or industrial uses or whatever, different size coal. And the lumber also, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that the lumber was brought in on cars and then the lumber company stored it and redistributed it. I don't think they were cutting their own lumber. They had a saw shop there that was mainly to make boxes, but I don't think they were cutting large dimension lumber for construction.
Phil, also here on the left side of your incredible layout here, it looks like some type of lumber storage company. Can you tell us about that?
Now that's interesting because this is one of the hybrid facilities. It's partly still there and it's partly not still there. And the main building has been modified so that it doesn't look exactly like the building now, but all the parts are still there, matching it up with old photographs. We're able to reconstruct what it would have looked like in 1945. It had a pass-through door for trucks loaded with coal to drive in, and there was a scale inside. So what they would do is they'd come to the large, tall, red building, which is the coal elevator. they'd load up the truck and then drive onto the scale, and they were charged according to the weight minus the weight of the truck, and then they would go out and deliver the coal to the various houses and businesses around town. And behind that is the lumber facility, and the large lumber shed, the open one, which you can see in the background, is still there exactly like that. It hasn't been changed. The one on the near side that the people are painting isn't there anymore, but it's been replaced with another structure. And the small shed in the middle of the layout area is still there, but it isn't on that spot. It's been moved up closer to the main building. Kind of an interesting story. Model making has its own rewards sometimes. The guys painting that building in the lumberyard is actually built on a mistake I made when I was just starting out. The lumberyard were some of the first buildings that I made, and working with that long shed, I painted it red, and then I wanted to weather it or antique it, give it a look of being an older building. So before the paint was as dry as it should have been, I took some solvent-based stain and I started brushing it on, which I've done with other things to give them an antique look. And I was horrified because the paint that I'd put on before started to come off. And so I thought, what am I going to do now? And I looked at it and I said, you know, that looks like it's peeling paint. Why don't I just convert the whole scene into people repainting an old weathered building with peeling paint? And that's what I did with that one. The coal building is of interest because it has a storage area or a loading dock. You can't see it, it's behind the coal cars, but there's a loading dock where they could unload things other than coal. So most of these buildings had multi-purpose facilities. You could unload boxes. Let's say you'd ordered some equipment in a big wooden box, and you could then pull your freight car with the box in it up to that loading dock, and you could put the box off the freight car into the trackside part of the loading dock. Then you'd bring your own truck to the street side part of the loading dock and shove the box through and onto the truck. And we can move those cars so that you can see that when we get over into that area. The depot I set up as 1945. There's soldiers there. They're on leave. I don't know if they're coming home or going back to the base, but they're waiting for the train. This train had a very minuscule passenger service. It was called a short train. Basically, it had a few cars, oil car, a couple box cars, and the milk cars, of course, for bringing milk down and picking it up. But the combine, which is at the very end of this train, is kind of a unique car because it's part passenger car and part baggage car and part caboose. This train didn't have a caboose, and from early photographs I was able to reconstruct this combine, and the combine had a few seats in the front for passengers, so the small number of passengers that had to travel down to Cortland or wherever could get on the front end of the combine. Baggage that was being shipped, mail and other things, went in the middle of the combine, and then there's a window on the combine that has kind of a framework around it, and for a long time I had no idea what this was. And then somebody said, well, the people that served on the train, the crew, had to ride somewhere, and there was no caboose, so they rode in the combine, and what that window is a weather guard around an open window to allow the people at the back of the train to look out, because they had to check the train to see if it was all right and whether or not they had a hot box on the wheels or any problem like that. And so that's where the crew rode. So this is a combination caboose, baggage car, and passenger car all in one. And it took me a long time to find a stock car that was right. Online I kept looking and looking. I finally found one, and then when I got it I had to modify it to match the historical information.
That's fascinating, Phil. So back over in front of the service garage, it looks like there's a white milk truck, or what is that thing?
Yeah, that's a 1940s milk delivery van, and all of these vehicles were purchased according to the date. So 1945 is the cutoff, so everything here has to date before 1945. So I've got some 1930s sedans. My father drove a black 1940 Chevy, I think it was, and I couldn't get a Chevy, so I got a Ford, but it's as close as I could get. All of the railroad cars, the box cars and all of that, are the type that would have been used prior to the end of World War II. So there's nothing here that's out of date or that is beyond the date for the cutoff.
Well, here's a really interesting one, Phil. It looks like this is some sort of outhouse or bathroom. You look like you have actually a replica of a 1945 toilet paper roll.
Yeah, it's a little large, but yeah, of course, most facilities, including the depot itself, had outhouses. If you look at the depot, you'll see to the left of it a small structure. That's the outhouse for the depot. So if you were catching a train and the urge overtook you, there wasn't any inside facility in the depot, so you went up to the little outhouse. And the depot is another example of this multi-use building. You can see on the left side behind the soldiers, that's a baggage pass-through dock, and on the other side is a street side baggage door. And so if you delivered something by train, it would go in the front, in this trackside door, and then it would be picked up by a truck on the other side, and vice versa. If you were shipping something out, you would drop it off at the other side of the depot and put it on the loading dock and then shove it through to the trackside, and when the train arrived, you'd load it onto the car.
Over here on the right side of your replica is a gray-brown structure with looks like a car bringing some canisters of milk. Can you tell us about that structure?
Right, that's the creamery, and it may be the largest industry that was in Woodstock at this time. Milk going out, you know, New York was a great dairy state, and milk was constantly being shipped out, so milk cars would come through in the morning, pick up the milk, and then be picked up and taken down to New York City or Scranton, Pennsylvania, or wherever they'd go. And then sometimes cheese was shipped out, and then the empties would come back. And that's the creamery, and this is one of the buildings where on the far side there's a lot of detail. I have a photograph from the 1940s showing the other side of the creamery with people loading milk into the milk cars, and I duplicated that exactly, but you can't see it unless you know, can somehow magically look behind the building. But the creamery is interesting because the main core of the building, the large rectangular central part, is still there. It's an apartment house, and so all I had to do was measure the foundation and take some pictures, but I also had some very good photographs of that structure, and you know, that, unlike the seed and feed store, still exists in some form.
And this is a really interesting area over here next to the railroad track. It looks where the railroad track splits and one goes to the train station. It looks like some guys are on some, looks like one of those old-time carts they pump up or something like that, or what are they doing over there?
Yeah, exactly. That's a service shed for the rail yard, and so that was not really known to exist until I got a map from about 1906 that showed a little shed there, and I wasn't sure what it looked like until I got some photographs on eBay. Somebody was selling photographs from about the 1906, 1909 period, looking up the tracks, and it showed the shed in the background, so I was able to model that accurately. And that, what that is you're right, a pump car. I don't know if that's I think that's electric or gasoline powered, but anyway, you would shove that onto the tracks from the shed area, and then you could go up and down the line. If you had to repair something, let's say there was some problem with the track and you had to go down and take care of it, so in between trains, there was only one train in the morning and one in the afternoon, so you had plenty of time to fix things. You would take that car down to wherever it needed to go.
And what's really picturesque about this town, I presume this is also accurate, is this little river that's running underneath the railroad tracks. What is that?
There is a stream. Now I had to, because the actual railroad goes straight as an arrow for dozens of miles, and I don't have dozens of miles to model in the cellar here, So I had to put a loop in there, and that loop goes around behind the layout and comes out the other side. But the interesting thing that's 100% accurate is that it was on an elevated embankment coming into New Woodstock, and New Woodstock is on a sort of plateau. So there was a bridge, a small bridge, over this stream, and that's still out there. That entire bridge is still there. The abutments are still there. One is concrete, one is stone. And so I went out and I photographed and measured that, and I basically recreated that pass over the stream coming into town. And it's kind of interesting because as you sight from that into the town, you get this sense of coming along an embankment and then entering the plateau on which the whole village is located. And so in that ravine, beyond that bridge, I put, various things, bears and deer and stuff like that, just to make it interesting, because I couldn't model the embankment straight as it was in reality. I had to have a curve in it. And on the train, you may notice in 1945 there were a lot of hobos traveling. So up at the end there's a hobo camp in the woods, and there are some hobos on the boxcar taking a free ride.
Huh. So, and lastly, there is an area right in back of the milk storage business that looked like some bales of hay, or what is that?
Actually, that's a cement block. It's not a company, obviously, because it's just a little shed. But I had a picture of some bundles strapped up of cement blocks that were being delivered, and you will notice that the little garage up at the end is made out of cement block. The picture may have captured a single event. Maybe somebody ordered a few dozen cement blocks for a construction project, and it just happened that that day they photographed it.
That's great. So this is an interesting perspective you have here at the end of Main Street, where you put a picture that's looks really good, but that's a generic picture, is that right?
Yeah, there are several techniques you can use to create the idea of distance. One, I've used actually two of the several types. One is to get a photograph of an actual road or a street, and because the road is only, well, in one case the street is only about a foot long, but the street in reality goes on for several hundred feet. What you do is you put trees and landscape materials around it, and then put a photograph of that road continuing in the distance. And when you look at it, you don't see a wall abruptly at the edge of the layout, which is not even 4 feet wide, but you see what appears to be a street going into the distance. The other technique is a mirror, and I use that in the stream ravine. You put a mirror up at the wall, and the reflection shows what's in front of it, and appears to be the same thing going on. So if you look at the stream bed as it goes into the distance, you'll see the stream bed going on forever, but it's just a reflection in the mirror.
So Phil, in ending, what was the biggest challenge building this? Was it finding time to do it? Was it finding the parts to build all this stuff de novo? Was it finding photographs? Was it convincing the wife that you could spend your entire weekend down here? What?
It's interesting. Well, it's also the space. 16 feet of prime real estate here, taken up by a model railroad. But I would say that there wasn't really a hard part, because that suggests it was unpleasant or difficult. Basically, it was all fun and interesting, and my philosophy is that 90% of happiness comes from anticipation, something you're looking forward to. And I'd get up in the morning and say, I'm going to work on that creamery today, and then creation, which is actually making all these buildings and putting it together, and being able to look at a miniature version of the village where you lived in 1945. And then the third part of it is what I call expression, that you're sharing this. So by talking about it, by putting photographs on the website, you're sharing this with other people. So there was no part that was difficult. Some of it was a lot of work. The trees, some of which are weeds, some of which are purchased moss trees. You can get moss in a craft store, and you put it on a little armature of twigs, and it looks like a maple tree. Some of them are what are called super trees, which come from, I'm not even sure where, they may even come from Europe. They're a weed like a tumbleweed, and when you break it apart, it looks like a tree. And then you spray it with, well, first you paint it black, and you spray it with adhesive, and then you dip it into shredded foam. All of the landscape materials, the grasses, the leaves, everything else, is shredded foam in different colors. And you dip it into that dark green, and then you take some light green foam and you sprinkle that on for sunlight highlights, and then you spray it with hairspray. And now you have a tree. That's time consuming. Pine trees are made out of scouring pads. It's time consuming, and probably the most difficult part was at the very beginning when I had to figure out how to put everything together in the corner so it actually fit. And you can't have a radius turn of less than 18 inches. Or 30, let's see, it's 18-inch radius, so that's hard to fit in this kind of space. But the landscape, I've got here an idea. It's all built on foam, extruded foam. So it's the kind of stuff they use in structures. And it's 2-inch foam. This is 1-inch foam, but I use 2-inch. And it's very rigid, but it's very light. So first what you do is paint it brown. Then you put on some sifted peat moss, which is right out of the gardening store. So you sift it so it's fine, put it on, then you spray it with a mixture of half Elmer's glue and half water. And sometimes a little alcohol or soap in it will help it soak in. So that gives you your ground base. Then you sprinkle on some of that ground foam for a light base. This is like a dirt color. Then you have a dark grass. And after each time you take alcohol and glue, and the alcohol breaks down the surface tension so that it soaks in. And then the glue dries, then you add highlight grasses, low bushes, bigger bushes, and suddenly you've created a landscape. And that was fun because it's not hard work, but when you're done you can look at it and say, I just created a little miniature world in my basement. So I wouldn't say any of it was difficult. The time-consuming part was at the beginning when I had to figure out where to put things so they would fit and the railroad would work.